There are moments in professional tennis when the draw sheet does something a press conference never could. A name disappears from a line, another slides quietly into its place, and the sport shifts, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with a kind of understated consequence that only reveals itself weeks later, sometimes months, sometimes not until someone is lifting a trophy in a stadium they once watched on a screen from the other side of the world. What happened in Strasbourg this week is one of those moments. Alexandra Eala, 20 years old, Filipino, and among the most discussed young players on the WTA Tour in 2026, have been elevated directly into main draw of the Strasbourg International following Océane Baptiste's withdrawal from the entry list. No qualifying, no grueling three-set battles in front of a handful of spectators on a Tuesday morning. Straight into the main event. Straight into the European clay season's final dress rehearsal before the gates of Roland Garros swing open. You can call it fortune. You would not be wrong. But dismissing it as merely that would be to misread the entire arc of what this young woman has been building patiently and relentlessly across the last 18 months of her career. The sport has never been especially sentimental about how a player enters a tournament. What it remembers, what it always remembers, is what they do once they're in. Think back to 1999. A 17-year-old Serena Williams, seeded 7th at the U.S. Open, benefited from a draw that opened unexpectedly when higher seeds fell in the early rounds, and she carved a path to her first Grand Slam title without facing the very top of the rankings until the final. Nobody argued afterwards that the draw had gifted her the trophy. What people remember was the ferocity of the tennis. The draw is a door. What you do on the other side of it, that is entirely yours. And the reason the tennis world is paying attention to what happened in Strasbourg this week is not simply that a withdrawal created an opening. It is that the player who stepped through that opening has spent the first half of 2026 quietly, methodically proving that she belongs in any main draw on any surface on this tour. The European clay season occupies a specific psychological space in professional tennis that no other stretch of the calendar quite replicates. From Madrid through Rome to Strasbourg and then on to Paris, the players who compete on this red dirt are not simply chasing ranking points. They are calibrating themselves. They are testing the architecture of their games against the most demanding surface in the sport, a surface that punishes impatience, rewards physical endurance, and has a unique way of exposing every weakness a player has tried to conceal on faster courts. Clay is honest. It cannot be bullied into submission by a single aggressive shot. It asks questions of your footwork, your fitness, your willingness to extend a rally past the point where your lungs begin to burn, and your tactical intelligence when the obvious play has been neutralized 3 shots ago, and you must improvise. These are not small requirements. They are the full measure of a tennis player, and they are precisely why the weeks leading into Roland Garros are scrutinized with such intensity by coaches, analysts, and players themselves. For Alexandra Eala, stepping directly into the Strasbourg main draw without the physical toll of qualification is not a minor administrative detail. It is, when examined honestly, a significant tactical advantage, and one she has a game to exploit. The qualifying rounds at clay court WTA events are physically punishing in a way that distinguishes them from qualifying at hard court tournaments. The rallies are longer. The court surface demands more lateral movement, more sliding, more explosive recovery from low balls. A player who comes through 2 or 3 qualifying matches on clay before reaching the main draw arrives with a body that has already begun accumulating the micro-fatigue that accumulates round by round. Across the week, she may have sharpened her timing. She may have found her rhythm, but she has also spent something. And in the later rounds, when the quality of opposition rises and the points become longer and the margins between winning and losing narrow to fractions, that physical cost begins to surface. Eala enters Strasbourg carrying none of that debt. Her preparation time, the hours of practice, the tactical planning sessions with her coaching team, the physical and mental rest remains intact. Against players who have come through qualifying, this is a meaningful edge. Against players who may have traveled directly from a previous tournament and whose own fatigue levels are uncertain, it is still significant. The freshness of the body translates, almost always, into the composure of the mind. And composure, as the 2026 season has repeatedly demonstrated, is one of Eala's developing strengths. What this year has shown, across events in Indian Wells, Miami, and Rome, is a player in active, visible evolution. Not the kind of evolution that gets announced, the new serve, the retooled backhand, but the subtler, more durable kind that unfolds in the way a player positions herself during baseline exchanges, in the way she chooses to redirect a rally rather than force a winner from a position of slight disadvantage, in the way she has begun to control the tempo of points rather than simply react to the tempo her opponent sets. There's a phrase that former players and long-serving coaches use to describe this transition in a young player's development. They say she has started to play the score rather than the ball. What they mean is that the tactical awareness has expanded beyond the immediate moment, beyond the next shot, into an understanding of where in the match she is and what the situation actually requires. A player who only plays the ball hits the same way in the first game of the first set and the third game of the third set. A player who plays the score, who understands pressure as a variable to be managed rather than a force to be overcome, adjusts. Eala, through the first half of this season, has begun to show that capacity with increasing regularity. Her performances against top 50 opposition in 2026 have drawn attention from people who are not easily impressed. This is a tour that has, in recent years, been contested by some of the most complete baseliners in the sport's history. Players whose ground stroke depth, defensive retrieving, and mental resilience across 5 or 6 days of tournament play set a standard that separates the legitimately elite from the merely talented. When Eala has been able to extend rallies into double digits against this tier of opposition, and not only sustain the exchange but find angles and pace variations that create genuine discomfort, analysts have taken note. Not because a young player holding her own against better-ranked opponents is unprecedented. The tour has produced any number of promising teenagers who competed well for a season or two before stalling, but because the manner of these performances has suggested something more than talent. It has suggested structure. It has suggested a player who understands the architecture of a point on clay well enough to impose her own logic on it, rather than being perpetually subject to someone else's. Her serve remains a component of her game that draws the most critical scrutiny. This is not a secret, and serious observers of her development have been watching closely to see whether the work done between tournaments has begun to produce consistent results under match pressure. The serve on clay matters differently than on hard courts. It does not need to be a weapon in the same way. The surface takes some of its pace away regardless, but it does need to be reliable enough to prevent opponents from standing well inside the baseline and taking control of the rally from the very first ball. A double fault at 30-all in the third set of a close match on clay is not simply 2 missed shots. It is a momentum transfer, a gift of confidence to the opponent at precisely the moment when the outcome is most uncertain. Eala is aware of this. Her coaching team is aware of this. The question Strasbourg will help answer is whether the work she has done to address it holds under the specific pressure of a high-stakes main draw event, against opponents who know her game well enough to exploit any hesitation on second serve. Océane Baptiste's withdrawal is worth examining briefly for what it tells us about the landscape Eala is entering. Baptiste, an American player who has shown considerable promise of her own on clay, was not someone whose name would have represented a straightforward first-round assignment. She is athletic, aggressive, and comfortable on the surface. Her presence on the entry list ahead of Eala reflected the small but real difference in their rankings at the time of the original draw. The withdrawal, whatever its cause, has removed from the event a player capable of causing early problems for anyone. Eala takes her spot, but she does not take her draw position in any soft-seated sense. She enters into a main draw that will contain the full weight of the European clay season's competitive field, players sharpening their games ahead of Paris, players with something to prove, and rankings points to chase. There is no easy match in a WTA main draw in May. There is no quiet corner of the bracket where a player can ease herself in. This is, of course, precisely the point. If Eala were to use this entry as an opportunity for protected, low-pressure experience, it would represent a missed opportunity of the first order. The players she could potentially face in Strasbourg, depending on how the bracket unfolds, are exactly the kind of opponents whose games provide information about whether a player is ready to compete at Roland Garros at the level her ranking and her recent performances have suggested she might be capable of. Grand Slams do not reward players who have been careful. They reward players who have been tested. The Filipino tennis community's investment in Eala's career has reached a pitch of intensity in 2026 that carries its own weight. This is both a gift and a complication. When a nation, particularly a nation with little historical representation at the highest levels of sport, identifies with a player the way the Philippines has identified with Eala, the emotional stakes of every match become elevated in ways that extend far beyond the court. Every win is not merely a win. It is a confirmation of possibility, a proof that the geography of tennis excellence is not fixed permanently around traditional tennis nations of Europe, North America, and Australia. Every loss, conversely, is felt with a sharpness that can be disproportionate to its actual significance in the context of a long career. Eala has grown up navigating this dynamic, and how she processes it, whether the weight of national expectation compresses her game, or whether she has found a way to carry it as fuel rather than burden, may be one of the most psychologically interesting questions her development raises. She would not be the first player to have grown through exactly this pressure. Martina Hingis, at 16, carried the hopes of a Swiss tennis culture that had not seen a major champion in decades. She did not break under it. She flourished. Sania Mirza, arriving on the WTA Tour from India in the mid-2000s, understood from her first professional match that she was playing for more than herself, for more than a ranking, more than prize money. The scrutiny was constant and occasionally suffocating. She found a way. Whether Eala can do the same at the highest level of the singles game remains one of the great open questions of this era of women's tennis. And Strasbourg, given the circumstances of her entry, may provide a more vivid chapter in that answer than either player or observer expected. There is a broader context to consider here, one that requires stepping back from Eala's individual story and looking at the state of the WTA Tour as it moves toward Roland Garros. The clay season of 2026 has already produced results that suggest the top of the women's game is in a period of genuine competitive flux. Several players who were considered certainties for deep runs at the French Open have shown inconsistencies in their form, whether through early tournament exits, visible signs of accumulated fatigue, or tactical limitations that have been exposed more readily on clay than on hard courts. Into this landscape, with a field behind the very top seeds is more open than has been in several years, a player with Eala's combination of fresh legs, developing tactical intelligence, and a specific confidence that comes from recent strong performances is not merely an interesting story. She is, at least in the reckoning of those who assess these things seriously, a genuine variable. Variables are what make the clay season compelling. The surface's slow pace and physical demands mean that upsets are possible across the board in a way that faster courts sometimes prevent. A player can be battered through sheer hitting power on hard courts in a way the clay simply will not permit. On clay, a player can hang in. She can retrieve. She can extend the match past a point where her opponent's confidence holds, and then the match becomes something else entirely. A test of nerve, of fitness, of belief. Eala, at her best, has shown elements of all three. The question of whether she can sustain them across the full length of a competitive WTA clay court week, 5 or 6 matches at the very upper register her ability, is a question this tournament is ideally positioned to begin answering. The coaching environment around her matters enormously here and deserves acknowledgement. The specific tactical instructions she is receiving about when to take time off the ball and when to attack, about how to read the tendencies of European clay specialists who have been playing this surface since they were children, about how to manage the physical demands of a week that asks progressively more of you as it unfolds. These are not small variables. They are the difference, sometimes, between a player who reaches the quarterfinal and a player who reaches the final. The best coaches do not just improve technique. They teach players how to think, how to manage a match as it shifts and breathes, and changes shape in real time. Whether Eala's coaching team has equipped her adequately for this specific moment, for the specific challenge of performing in a main draw that she did not expect to enter under these circumstances, will be visible in the way she plays from the first ball of the first match. What the 2026 season has already established, without equivocation, is that Eala is no longer competing at the margins of the WTA Tour's consciousness. The qualifying rounds, the early exits, the occasional flash of brilliance that prompted qualified praise from commentators careful not to overstate what they were seeing. That phase is over. The performances in the earlier hardcore events of this year announced, plainly enough for even the most skeptical observer to acknowledge, that something has shifted. The talent was always visible. Talent in professional tennis is not rare, The tour is full of talented young women who are exceptional junior players and who arrive on the tour with every physical gift the sport demands. What the tour separates, relentlessly and without mercy, is the talent from the complete players. The ones who can compete across 3 sets against an opponent who has read their game thoroughly and adjusted. The ones who, when a match turns against them in the second set, do not retreat into defensive passivity, but find within themselves the clarity to change the pattern. Eala, in 2026, has begun to show the qualities of the complete player more consistently than at any earlier point in her career. That is a foundation on which this Strasbourg opportunity rests, and it is why the foundation matters. The week ahead in Strasbourg will tell us things. Not everything. One tournament never does, but things, whether she can convert the physical advantage of entering fresh, whether her serve holds under match pressure against opponents who will test it deliberately and methodically, whether her court positioning, which analysts have identified as markedly improved this year, is consistent enough to allow her to dictate from the baseline against players who have spent their careers learning to redirect this kind of pressure, whether the weight of expectation, of a nation watching, of a world beginning to watch, translates into elevated performance or manifests as the kind of tightness that no amount of preparation fully prevents the first time a player finds herself in a genuinely big match. The bracket will determine who she faces. Her game will determine what happens when she does. Step further back now. Beyond Strasbourg, beyond Roland Garros, beyond the immediate questions this week raises. Consider what it would mean historically, genuinely, for the Philippines to produce a Grand Slam champion. The Southeast Asian region has contributed remarkable players to the tour across the decades. Tamarine Tenisugarn's career in the late 1990s and 2000s showed what was possible from a region largely invisible in elite conversation, and players from Japan and China have in recent years risen to genuine top 10 and top 5 status. But a Grand Slam champion from this part of the world would carry a weight that is difficult to overstate, not simply for national pride, though that would be enormous and entirely warranted, but for what it would mean to the geography of the sport itself, to the junior development pipelines in countries that have largely sent their best athletes to other sports, to the young girls in Manila and Cebu and Davao who watch tennis on screens and wonder, in the way children wonder, whether a version of that life is available to them. Tennis has always been a sport that takes root where excellence appears to prove it can take root. When Guillermo Vilas electrified Argentine tennis in the 1970s, a generation of children picked up rackets. When Novak Djokovic began winning majors, Serbian tennis infrastructure expanded in ways that had seemed unimaginable a decade earlier. The appearance of genuine, sustained excellence from an unexpected place changes the sport's mental map in lasting ways. Eala is not yet a Grand Slam champion. She is 20 years old, and the distances between where she stands now and where those trophies live are real and should not be papered over with convenient narrative arcs. But she is, in this 2026 season, close enough that the conversation is no longer premature. That is new. That, in itself, is history in the making. There are also the questions this moment leaves unanswered, the ones that cannot be resolved in Strasbourg or anywhere else in the next few weeks, only across a longer arc of career. Will her physical development allow her to sustain the intensity of a clay court season deep into the second half of her 20s, when a game typically rewards players who have built 5 or 6 years of clay-specific conditioning into their bodies? Will the serve she is working to make more consistent become a genuine asset, or will it remain a component of her game that sophisticated opponents identify and exploit? And perhaps most interestingly, will the pressure representing an entire nation's tennis hopes of being not just a player but a symbol refine her or gradually compress her? History provides precedents for both outcomes. It provides no formula. What it does provide is the weight of what has already been done. The fact that this conversation is happening at all, that the withdrawal of an American player from a clay court event in France generates serious discussion about Filipino tennis, about a Grand Slam candidacy, about the map of women's tennis shifting, is itself the story, not a story with a neat ending, not a story with a destination already visible on the horizon, but a story that is genuinely, beautifully unresolved. Those are the best kind. Alexandra Eala steps into the Strasbourg main draw carrying all of it: the fresh legs, the developing game, the scrutiny, the hope of 16 million tennis fans who've been waiting a very long time for someone to carry the flag to this level. Whether this is a week she announces herself in Europe with something that cannot be qualified or contextualized away, only the matches will say. But the door is open. It opened in a mundane way. A withdrawal, a name removed, another name inserted in its place. It usually does. The significant doors almost never look significant until you walk through them and turn around and realize what you've left behind. She has walked through. The rest is hers to write.